This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 511 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I know this is a football podcast, but I'm sure there are people listening to this show who love hockey. And with the Stanley Cup playoffs underway, FanDuel is giving fans a special playoffs promotion, Correct Score Insurance. All you have to do is place a pre-live 60-minute correct score wager on any featured NHL playoff game. If your bet loses but your selected team wins the game, you get a refund of up to $25 in site credit. Even if the game goes into overtime, you are eligible for a refund. So head over to FanDuel today and win alongside your favorite team in the Stanley Cup playoffs. Must be 21 years or older and present in Colorado, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, or West Virginia. Refund issued as non-withdrawable site credit that expires in 7 days. Max refund $25. Terms apply. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In Colorado, call 1-800-522-4700. In Iowa, 1-800-BETS-OFF. In Indiana, 1-800-9-WITH-IT. For confidential help in Michigan, call 1-800-270-7117. In Tennessee, call the Red Line at 1-800-889-9789. And in West Virginia, visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net. Let's get to these mailbag questions. The first question this week is from @It'sThatBoy75. How would Julio Jones leaving Atlanta affect Kyle Pitts and Calvin Ridley? Well, they'd both have higher floors and ceilings. I mean, as it stands, both players have some room for growth from a target share standpoint in my projections. And with Julio in the picture, Ridley is the wide receiver 8 in my projections, while Pitts is the tight end 6, like I've been talking about on the show. But last year, we saw Ridley's PPR points per game average rise by 3 points when Julio Jones was out. And he went from about a 21% target share per game with Julio to a 30% share without him. He'd have that type of ceiling without Julio Jones. And then with Kyle Pitts, he goes from the number 3 to the number 2 option in that offense immediately. It ends up being very, very easy to project Kyle Pitts for about a 20% target share if Julio is gone. I mean, he could already hit that kind of target share with Julio Jones. But it's far easier to see that ceiling then without him. So both guys get a boost. I know the Falcons may not be as good offensively if Julio Jones is gone, but volume is more important than efficiency in fantasy football. We saw that last year with Calvin Ridley's Julio Jones splits. This next question is from @Ryan_5541. How is Joe Mixon receiving all this offseason hype if they added Chase and plan to throw all game long? If he's always underutilized in the passing game, I am missing something here. Gio was holding him back that much? So a couple of things here. A team throwing the ball a lot is not a bad thing for running backs. Targets are way more valuable for running backs than rush attempts are, especially in PPR leagues. But in standard leagues, they are too. Now, Giovanni Bernard did not miss that much time with the Bengals. But when he did, we saw a pretty significant bump in target share for Joe Mixon. In a 4-game stretch without Bernard back in 2018, Mixon averaged 19 PPR points per game. His target share per game was 14.6%. His lowest target share in any one of those games was 12.5%. I wouldn't understate the Giovanni Bernard loss. And yes, they added Jamar Chase, but they also lost AJ Green. AJ Green might have sucked last year, but he was still active and he gobbled up over 18% of the team's targets. Basically, it's not hard to see Joe Mixon's target share rising. And that's always been his issue. But I also think that people have generally been way too hard on Joe Mixon from a fantasy football standpoint. He averaged 16.6 PPR points per game before his injury last year. And he was basically a low-end RB1 in his 2 seasons before that. Like, let's stop pretending that Joe Mixon hasn't been absolutely fine. The Bernard loss is big. The Bengals could be strong offensively as long as Joe Burrow is healthy. And Mixon himself has already proven to have a baseline. He just hasn't had that monster target share season to bring it all together. And it definitely looks like he can have that this year. To me, he has just as good of odds among all the running backs being drafted around him to finish as a top 5 running back this season. This next question is an email. It says, "Hey JJ, love your content and your approach to fantasy football. Thanks. Not sure if I'm getting a bit nitpicky, but are you able to touch on Alvin Kamara and his outlook this year? I've seen him ranked mainly at the end of the top 4 backs with Christian McCaffrey, Dalvin Cook, and Saquon Barkley, and understand the narrative from last year that he won't get the same target share without Brees. Might just be because I'm super high on Kamara, but he seems to be number 2 to me, or even number 1 if you're concerned with Christian McCaffrey's health. Thanks a lot, Cal from Gold Coast, Australia. It's good to hear from people from the other side of the planet. So I think there's some concern with Kamara because there's always the chance that New Orleans goes with Taysom Hill, or even just simply uses Taysom Hill with Jameis Winston as the starter. And that's not a good thing. Not only did we see Kamara with his 3 worst target share games of the 2020 season when Drew Brees was out last year, but as I talked about in the episode earlier this week, rushing quarterbacks are generally not a good thing for running backs in fantasy football. So I think there are reasons to be concerned. And my projections share that concern, at least when compared to the top 4 running backs. Kamara is the RB4 in my projections, behind the players that you mentioned. And I think you can make the argument for Derrick Henry in that area as well. When we're talking about elite players like this, any piece of negative information can drop a player down a spot or 2. And I think in this case, it is a negative. Not having Drew Brees, that's a negative. Because the Saints have targeted their running backs at a really, really high rate with Drew Brees. And that's Alvin Kamara's game. Since 2011, the Saints' lowest single season target share to running backs has been 23.6%. For some context, the league average over this time, so the league average running back target share per team, 19.8%. Last season, that 23.6% target share number, the lowest that the Saints have had since 2011, that would have ranked 7th in the NFL. They target their running backs a lot. It's just going to be harder to maintain that even if the scheme generally calls for it. And even if Kamara is a great receiver, which he is. So as a result, Alvin Kamara gets knocked down. He's still an elite fantasy asset. It's not like he's not going to have a good target share. But he has more concerns than he otherwise would have now that Brees is out of the picture. There are question marks. And those question marks are not a good thing when you're a high-end draft selection. This next question is from @JoeHolm33. Who are you targeting as your wide receiver 1 if you go running back to start a draft? So this would entirely depend on whether you're at the top half of the draft or the bottom half of the draft. But I figured since I got this question this week, I'd bring up the MFL 10 of death that I'm doing with a bunch of fantasy analysts right now. We've been doing this best ball league for years, and we draft around this time of year each and every season. This year, I got the 12 spot, and I went with 2 running backs to start my draft. I went with Joe Mixon and Cam Akers. I then started pounding wide receiver. I got Allen Robinson and Terry McLaurin with my next 2 selections, and then Chase Claypool and Cortland Sutton with the 2 after that. It's a wide receiver heavy draft, but I was glad to come away with a bunch of alpha type pass catchers. I wouldn't really say I'm targeting anyone in particular as my wide receiver 1 with that kind of start, with a running back start. It just depends on who falls. There are a lot of good wide receivers in that round 3 to 6 range, like we see every single year. That's generally where I'm loading up on the position given historical hit rates versus running backs in that area of the draft, which, as a lot of you know, has been dubbed the running back dead zone. This next question is from @FantasyForecaster. How should one account for chance of injury when making projections? Do you assume players stay healthy or make an adjustment based on position? Okay, so there's 2 layers to this. The first one is something that I talked about with Dr. Edmund Porras back on episode 490. And that was the idea that injury proneness generally is not a thing. There are going to be players with more risk of injury entering a season, but the average fantasy analyst is going to overemphasize injury for the wrong players, or at least more than likely. So make sure you're getting information on that kind of thing from smart people who study that stuff for a living, like Edwin. And remember, there are only going to be a handful of players where injuries probably matter on the projections front. So to me and my process, it's easier to just subjectively factor in injury when I'm drafting as opposed to with my projections. And that's really the second layer to this. First, you should recognize that we often don't know what injury proneness actually is, but the second layer is how we're actually applying projections. If you're building projections just to get a better idea of situations and where players should generally land in fantasy drafts, but you're not building your rankings specifically off those projections, which I would say isn't always the smartest thing to do. Your rankings shouldn't just be your projections in rankings form. But if you're using projections more as a guide than anything else, then your projection accuracy as it pertains to injury is not the most important thing in the world. It's not that big of a deal. If you're Mike Clay over at ESPN and you're making projections for this massive platform that millions of people are going to see, that's different. Someone like Clay has to be super precise. But 99.9% of you listening to the show aren't making projections for a large number of people, more than likely. I don't know who listens to this show. I mean, I don't even make projections for a large number of people. As a result, I care a little bit less about how insanely accurate those projections are. Especially since if we use some sort of blanket way to project injuries, like if we automatically bump off a game for all running backs or something like that, it's all relative anyway. All running backs are then experiencing that in their projection, not a quarter of them or half of them. So this is really just a long-winded way of me saying I don't really factor in injury for my projections, only because of the way that I use my projections. They're there to guide me and to find value. And honestly, they're there to help me talk intelligently about situations. As a result, I can just be a little bit more subjective with specific players as it relates to injury when I'm actually drafting. This next question is from @SKStevenH. How do you feel about the ceilings of the rookie quarterbacks year one? Wilson and Lawrence are guaranteed starters, but who's the first of the others to take the reins? Mills, Lance, Fields, Jones? Thanks, JJ. So I think there's a difference between guaranteed starters and ceilings. Because I would argue that Justin Fields is most likely to be starter early on in the season versus the other quarterbacks that were listed. But I also think that Trey Lance has a higher ceiling from a fantasy football perspective than Justin Fields does. If I'm looking at year one redraft, I'm not worrying at all about Mac Jones and Davis Mills. There's really no need to. The other guys have draft capital and can bring that needed juice with their legs in fantasy. To me, Trevor Lawrence is an immediate high-end QB2. That's actually where my projections have him. I'd then be more interested in Lance and Fields, but it depends on when they'd be starting. And then Wilson likely ends up as a lower-end QB2 this year. But don't underestimate his ability to escape the pocket too. Lawrence is the safest from a floor to ceiling standpoint. But Fields and Lance both can provide QB1 ceilings this season because of their mobility. Legitimately. It just depends if they start right away. I think both will start games in 2021, but Fields has a higher chance to do it earlier, just given the competition there in Chicago. This next question is from @Eric Belair. Hey JJ, love the show. Thanks. Following up on Monday's show, do you think we should be more cautious about stacking mobile quarterbacks, considering the effect they have on their skilled players? Generally speaking, yes. And it's not just because the quarterback himself may be a bad passer. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the other things that I talked about on that show. How mobile quarterbacks are usually coming from run-heavy offenses. And how run-heavy offenses are generally not going to give you great output at pass-catching positions. I at least think it could be evidence to not go nuts stacking one of those offenses. Maybe go with just one pass catcher and that's it. Because think of this logically. If we know these teams with mobile quarterbacks are going to see less passing volume, then that means pass catchers on those teams, in order to be hyper fantasy relevant, they're going to need to capture really high target shares. And then on top of that, a lot of them will probably need to be an outlier from an efficiency standpoint, like we've seen with A.J. Brown. Meaning you have to pinpoint the player in one of those offenses, if that player exists, who's going to break the mold. But if one player is going to capture a high target share in an offense, then other players on his team may struggle to see a large target share from themselves. Like, let's look at Lamar Jackson in the Ravens offense. I've talked your ears off about the landing spot for Rashad Bateman and what it means for fantasy football. But for Rashad Bateman to hit, he'll likely need to be in that 25 to 30% target share range at least. Because the Ravens are likely to still be pretty run heavy regardless of the personnel. Because Lamar Jackson is their quarterback. So if that happens, if Rashad Bateman is seeing a 25+% target share, what are the odds that we see Hollywood Brown with that high of a target share as well? It's not super high. It doesn't mean that Brown can't be usable. It just means it's going to be more difficult for him to far, far exceed his ADP and be a league-winning type player. So I think it's still fine to stack. A player or two in those offenses can still be fine. We're just looking at general trends here. But I think logically, it makes sense to not want to stack one of those offenses the same way you might want to stack an offense like Cincinnati, where there should be a lot of passing volume, and where multiple pass catchers have a legitimate shot to far exceed their ADP. But I haven't done a study on this, so I don't know this with complete certainty. I'm just sort of brain vomiting based on the stuff that I discussed on the show from earlier in the week. The last question this week is from @PrimetimeMock. How heavily do you evaluate the risk of reaching for a player below ADP based on relative round? It's not gospel, but I usually try to stay closer to ADP in the early rounds, full degaffing after round 10, and sort of half gaff after round 6. Is that a decent baseline? So let's ask ourselves why we care about average draft position in the first place. I think it's because of 2 reasons. 1, you're trying to extract value. If you know you can generally get a player in round 10, there's no reason to draft him in round 3, because the chance that he's not there in round 7 or 8 is pretty slim. He's probably going to be there. And even if you miss out on that player, it's not the end of the world. The second reason is because ADP has some predictiveness to it. We're not that great at predicting which players will be good and which ones won't be good in fantasy football every single year. We're not perfect. We're also not terrible at it. There's some correlation between ADP and postseason result. So ignoring ADP doesn't necessarily make sense on the forecasting front either. That means when you're really reaching for a player, you're saying that you know better than the market. That your forecasting far exceeds what the market is saying, when the market is at least somewhat predictive. And that's fine to do when the opportunity cost is lower. You mentioned that you sort of half gaff between round 6 to round 10. And I'd say that's about right. Historically, the opportunity cost, or what you miss out on when you make a certain selection, the opportunity cost falls off once you get into that round 5, round 6 area. The players you miss out on just aren't that important because they don't have as high of expected values. This question also comes down to how much you're reaching. If you're getting a round 10 player in round 8, that doesn't really matter. It's not that big of a deal. If you're getting a round 5 player in round 2, then I would say that that would matter and that you're probably overinflating your own ability to predict things. And not only that, you're not thinking about variance or the fact that you could be wrong. And you're not actually attempting to extract value. It's not a logical thing to do. So I think the general rule of caring less when round 6 hits, that's fine in most formats. And once you hit the double-digit rounds, reaching is almost irrelevant. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoy your weekend, and I will talk to you next week.